Okay, we should be safe here for the night. Make camp. And let's discuss The Last of Us from HBOMax. The show has officially come to a conclusion, and I'm going to be doing my episode-by-episode review here, spoiler-filled, so watch up until the episode you have seen, or watch fully all the way through, knowing we're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty details. I'll get to my full season thoughts and how I think the show could have slightly benefited from a kind of different structure at the very end, but for now, let's go ahead and jump on into episode 1. This is the episode I'm going to spend the least amount of time on because you do already have a full deep dive here on the channel where I kind of go through the entire events of that episode, but I will just say I have now watched this episode 4 times due to Kayla wanting to show this to all of our friends and family, and it does hold up to repeat viewings. Granted, of course, if you watch anything that many times, you're going to start catching like small things that bug you a little bit here and there, but there's also such good setup for Joel's character, especially in this episode, that I don't know. I really do think this was as good a kickoff to the show that we as fans really could have expected, and episode 2 complements it really well. And I want to just give even more praise to the cold open, where we go back in time a little bit to just be introduced to the concept of the virus that we see at play here. And I generally liked these kind of disjointed cold opens we got to episodes, I think almost every single time. There were definitely some that ended up tying more directly into the episodes they were related to, but I just enjoy that format of storytelling. But to get into a lot of details here, let's go ahead and jump into episode 2. The star of episode 2 for me is Anna Torv. Her portrayal of Tess was so much richer than the games for me. Tess in the games has always been one of those characters that for me was just there for video game's sake to have someone who dies and that's the end of it. I also understand why they had her be killed by infected in this episode and not the Fedra. I think mainly because with hindsight now we know the infected within the Last of Us show weren't going to have as much screen time as they obviously do in the game, just because there's not going to be endless hours of combat like you get while playing the game, and instead, you know, they have to keep the narrative moving due to the medium shift. And while I do overall love how the infected are done, especially in the makeup design way, there were a few choices to me not fully connecting with how they are realizing these zombies throughout the show, which we'll get into a bit more in later episodes, but the seedlings of those problems started here. Overall though, episode 2, the set design, the pacing, and the acting all really stood up to where they needed to be. There is a complaint where if you're a diehard fan of the game and you really want that slower pacing, you could say, hey, this feels like a bit too much, like we're just getting from point A to B to C. I think that's largely going to be due to just whiplash of changing mediums, and it definitely is prevalent throughout the show, especially at the end, but episodes 1 and 2 could really almost be just viewed as their own like one movie-length feature, and how it sets up Joel and Ellie to then go off on their adventure was sensational, I think, overall in its execution, with just minor hitches. I also like the amount of characterization and humanization given to the Fedra. I mean, in these first 2 episodes, there's so much smaller work done to help set up Joel and his big reveal at the end of just exactly what kind of man he is. Yeah, he can pick up that child that they ended up injecting and dump it in the fire, and he's not happy about it, but he can do stuff like that. And of course, the way he's dealing drugs and cutting people in line and not giving a shit. Joel is, if you're paying attention, not a good guy. He's not the most evil bastard on the planet, but he's certainly someone who is about his motivations, his problems, his perspective and survival, which, of course, him and Tess make clear through their dialogue where they talk about they're not good people. He's traumatized to the point where it's a very common actual psychological phenomenon where if you've had what you deem most precious to you stripped from you, you then start to just cling like so hard to anything else. And to be perfectly clear, honest, I have lost friends to suicide and stuff, and I had to deal with a similar psychological thing for a while where I was horrified of being left for any reason. So I'm trying to think of like a really concise way to put it. Because it's like, yeah, I can relate to that. It's a traumatized to the point of incessant fear of more trauma. And episode 2 is the first episode, in my opinion, where we're really allowed to see the chemistry between Ellie and Joel, and Bella Ramsey and Pedro Pascal. When the writing was at its top notch for the show, nailed this chemistry. I really bought their friendship with a massive age gap, and Joel's slowly developing, viewing her as a surrogate daughter for the daughter he lost. I personally have a problem with, I think it's the end of actually episode 1 transitioning into 2, when we see Joel's PTSD like manifested with him like having an actual flashback to the shooting of his daughter. It's a personal preference thing, but we get it. We know if someone's gonna point a gun at a little girl in front of Joel, it's gonna remind him of that. We as an audience just watched it. Like, you don't need to do the flash. But they're also inconsistent with that, which once again we'll get into later on. But yes, overall, I would say episodes 1 and 2, I would actually rank them together because they are really like just, okay, this is the setup and kickoff of the show. And I'd give them a really solid 8, especially for how well they did recreate certain scenes from the games. Really did like that. I wish we had had like 1 or 2 more deep breaths in terms of pacing, but I was happy. Episode 3, Bill and Frank. Wow. Not only is this unexpected as a viewer coming into it, getting so much more clear backstory for characters that are a bit more minor in the games, but the representation of their relationship was so well done. I have had multiple people who are close to me who struggle with their own internalized homophobia say that this is the most okay they have felt with seeing a gay relationship on screen. I myself am bi, so I loved the representation, and the fact that some old heads in my life who typically get that kind of like boomer instinctual that's taught into them because of the media they consumed growing up, even they were like, this was great. Nick Offerman's performance was just sensational. I understand he's done other serious roles. I haven't seen them. So this is the first time I've seen him do anything aside from just stand-up comedy in Parks and Rec. I had no idea he had that caliber of very subdued acting that gives so much within him. He is brimming with emotion throughout this episode, but he's not screaming or yelling. It's my favorite kind of passionate acting, which is the most realistic seeming to me, because at least the people in my life don't often shriek at people, even in high emotion stakes. They just get tense or they get reserved, and Nick Offerman just embodied that perfectly. I also really laughed out loud for him setting up his compound. It was such a wonderful introduction to the character, having little details of like the tread on me flag and really just letting you know like, okay, this is who this guy is. It was fantastic. And Murray Bartlett, I think the actor's name is, who plays Frank. I saw him in The White Lotus, knew he had comedic talent, and he certainly brought that into a couple scenes within this episode. I laughed out loud repeatedly. But again, the dramatic acting, the love and bonding between these 2 men, and that heartbreaking moment where you see Frank realize he can't paint Bill anymore, and that's when he decides like it's time to go, was just sensational. And we have this climactic fight where I thought one of them was going to die during a raid, but instead we get something that's even more heart-wrenching, which is Bill realizing like, okay, if it's time for Frank to go, it's time for me to go. That's my heart, that's my soul, it's my partner, and the world is awful. It's my happiness is this individual. So yeah, it's my time to go too. I mean, don't get me wrong. In the real world, I am never an advocate for that kind of thing. But in a post-apocalyptic with supernatural infected zombies in a very hard to maintain compound where at any minute raiders or something worse could come in and torture you to death or turn you into some kind of mad zombie and your heart and soul is about to go out the door, absolutely, that's totally makes sense. If you had told me before the season started that The Last of Us would have an episode that was the best romance so far of 2023, I would not have fucking believed you. And they even managed to, the brief scenes with Tess and Joel being in here, which it's a major plus to get more scenes with Anna Torv. It again gave you more characterization with both of them. Joel being the more reserved, standoffish, on guard one, who is kind of slowly progressing to trust Bill and Frank, whereas Tess is just excited to have someone to trade and smuggle with. There's also some neat world building, some details of how they're managing to keep power on and various things. I just really thought this was one of the best structured episodes as a whole as well. And this is where we're kind of introduced to the fact that some of these are just going to be kind of mini stories taking place within a larger story. This happens repeatedly, and I actually am personally very partial to that. I like a grander narrative hiding smaller narratives within. If you want a recommendation, Hyperion, one of the best books I've ever read. But now we get to episodes 4 and 5, which I still very much so liked, but I have more clear criticisms to put forth onto them as well. First of all, the villain of Rose from 2.5 Men, surprisingly effective. The soft villain is always someone who's going to really put a shiver down my spine when done well. And wow. Melanie Lynskey, I think is how you say her name, managed to not go over the top, which in my opinion is cancerous to a villainous performance like this when someone starts like frothing at the mouth for no reason. And instead, the vibe I got from her for like the entire episode was just like she's in pain and she's hurting others because of how much pain she's holding in herself. I also really liked the lack of mercy for world building, where we see, yeah, Fedra thrown over here. Is that all good? Not really. There's some really bad things happening within this community as well. And of course, the star of these 2 episodes and the foil used to progress the characterization and bonding of Joel and Ellie is going to be Sam and Henry. Not only were these rock solid performances, but the addition of having Sam as deaf wasn't just a gimmick that was just placed in here to maybe get more sympathy or something along those lines, but was utilized repeatedly throughout the narrative for moments where they could talk openly in front of Sam about stuff that he, shouldn't know. And then you see the choices to lie to this character have a bit more weight because they have to physically tell them certain things at times, like, oh no, we're okay. He'll probably be back. Not actually, and things along those lines. I also, just from a structure standpoint, the way they did like telling bits of story out of order actually was crystal clear. Typically when you have someone get shot in the face, you can assume like, yeah, okay, seeing them again, we're seeing that before now, but I don't know, it was just well done. And this is going to be such a specific thing, but I'm hoping someone in my audience can relate to this. The fact that Joel and Ellie put down some glass to like make a noise as someone tried to sneak up on them and it didn't work is something I actually really enjoy, because I hate how in movies and TVs, every time someone sets a trap, it usually works exactly as planned. That is not how traps work. Laying traps is really hard, and if someone can spot it and you are not hyper aware to try and catch whatever result of them trying to avoid it is, with Joel and Ellie being asleep, of course they're not. Yeah, they were able to be snuck up on even though they laid down glass, which is just an element of realism that this show stuck to that I think was fantastic. I think Joel and Ellie from the game had their emotional resonance a little stronger throughout the entire story, but Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey and this retelling of Last of Us still were solid enough for me to be emotionally hooked onto them. And even though I knew they had to live to the end, feel the moments where, yeah, they have a gun in their face. That is scary. But in a writing perspective, in these 2 episodes, we see Joel and Ellie wake up with guns in their faces, but we also then learn through the jump back in time and progression forward that those guns are empty and the people coming to them, they're not really a threat. They're desperate for help. And from a writing perspective, I adore recontextualization of high stakes scenes, because suddenly knowing those guns are empty and knowing what kind of person Joel is, I stopped being afraid for Joel and Ellie and I started being afraid for the 2 people desperate for help, because they do not realize that Joel is the monster in the room. I don't think Joel's a horrible person, but of anyone in that room, he is certainly the one who is most willing to go to violence quickly. And you can dive into Pedro Pascal's embodiment of Joel in all kinds of different ways, but I think the element of danger, what he felt like in terms of a threat to nearly everyone around him, was one of the few elements that Pedro Pascal even managed to elevate from Joel in the game. I actually felt he was more dangerous, and I think that's just because Pedro Pascal really managed to come across just big and intimidating on the screen. I assumed he was like 6'2". Motherfucker's my height. He's 5'11". And then the heart-wrenching finale. Wow! I knew it was coming, and it still just hurt. And I had a couple friends who brought up an issue with Bella Ramsey just trying to use her own blood to prevent Sam from coming back as an infected and not warning anybody. I agree to an extent that it's a stupid decision, but I'm more than willing to just kind of push that aside for the fact that, one, she's never taken a real science class. She went to Fedra schooling and her education is lacking. 2, she doesn't fully trust Joel at this point, and she sees him as someone who has done extreme violence and is not sure how he would handle seeing this kid transformed, and also putting the emotional weight on telling Henry what has happened to Sam, probably the worst thing imaginable to tell someone has happened to their loved one. I don't think a kid could do that. I think if Bella Ramsey's performance had come across a little more desperate in that moment, that would have been a bit more communicated. She seemed just kind of excited instead of desperate, and maybe I just need to rewatch this episode again to get what they were going for, but overall, I still found it to be incredibly emotionally poignant. The weight of Henry having to kill Sam and then just Pedro Pascal begging him, give me the gun, and we all know what's going to happen. There's no way he's going to live after what he was just forced to do to protect Ellie, and offs himself, and then you feel that, and there is this really great pause, I want to say, as they're taking care of the bodies and everything, that set in on my shoulders just how bleak this world is. It never quite managed to reach the levels of bleak as like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, but it came damn near close. And special mention to Bella Ramsey's performance when Ellie watches Henry kill himself, and just that gasp, that audible cry, then freeze, was so human. Now, my bigger problem with these two episodes comes with the undead emergence from the underground, which didn't feel connected enough to the wider story to actually feel like anything else aside from just a gimmick to get this section of it over with. And this big showdown where the bad guys are just slowly walking towards our protagonists, hiding behind cards, no urgency, and just like this weird monologuing back and forth, essentially just buying time until this big pop could happen, felt forced. And then the big super infected, it's like service for the game, but it didn't really, to me personally, feel like it fit in this version of the world. You don't need to bring in every major element from the adaptation, especially when it just looks so stand out from otherwise really great infected. Though, one positive for that negative, watching the military guy get his head just whoosh by the infected, fucking rat. Then we get into Kin, which is episode 6. And this one I think is probably the most rewatchable for just like character beats and understanding how Joel and Ellie got to the point where Ellie desperately wants Joel to stick with her because he's the one person who's really protected her. And after everything they've been through together, she has at least the trust and liking of him to not want to be passed off to someone else she doesn't know, no matter how much Joel vouches for them. With what we learned about Ellie's past, throughout the rest of the show and through other things, it makes complete sense. It also had a good juxtaposition with how Tommy seems to have been able to pull back from the darkness they had to be steeped in to the point where he's trying to be an upstanding guy, whereas Joel doesn't even really seem to have that option. Like, he is so consumed in his cloud that as a character, you just know he'll never be able to reach the level of peace that Tommy has, at least in a healthy way, which again, we'll get into more later. I also like the opening of them taking this elder couple who are just surviving peacefully, secluded in the nowhere, hostage, and interrogating them for information. And there was some really funny moments, but also this underlying tension. It was a good opener. It was also this episode where I feel like Bella Ramsey embodied Ellie the best for me. From the tense moment where the dog doesn't smell the infection on her and she's able to start petting it and giggling, to how she handles this safer place and some of the moments of other people looking out for her, yet also keeping her guard up. It felt really true to a new interpretation of this character. It kept the core, but was different enough to be interesting. And that's kind of the theme of the entire show. It has flaws that we're going to get into more, especially in the next episode. But overall, I liked this retelling of Last of Us, and I don't feel like it detracted from the overall game or anything else. It's just a great marketing tool to get more people to play it. And despite me at first having some issues with how they were realizing like rebuilt society at times, I fully adjusted and embraced the aesthetic of the show at this point as well, because I feel like it looked the best when it was either out in nature, because you can't really mess that up, or when it was in these kind of like makeshift towns that have since come about repurposing things that were there to just fully reskin them, and not the cities where I think at certain points the VFX elements weren't as strong. Like in this place where society is rebuilding and they are communists, I was fully immersed on an aesthetics level. Then we get to episode 7, which is an episode I wanted to love so much because at face value, everything they're doing here, I actually think could be really great to see on the screen. I just hate to say, unfortunately, the chemistry between Ellie and Riley, I didn't buy. And unfortunately, it was a combination of both the writing and the performance from the actress behind Riley. I have mild experience with acting in college. It's an incredibly challenging art form, especially if you can be a quality actor, your partner can be a quality actor, but if you just can't have chemistry, there's not too much you can do to recover from that. I haven't seen Storm Reed's other work, but apparently they've been in very critically acclaimed stuff, but I just wasn't buying it. Also, seeing this angle of inside the Fedra schools, for some reason, just didn't interest me that much, so like seeing Bella Ramsey amongst kids that were like bullying her and stuff, it just felt kind of pale in comparison of the larger, wider threats we've seen going on. Seeing the captain who was trying to work with Ellie, like, I know that's not going to work out. What's being set up isn't very interesting because we know where all of it's headed, so I'm not left wondering anything. So for me, this was the weakest episode, except it had one of the best scenes in it, and that was the actual ending, where Riley and Ellie are dealing with the fact that they've both been bit, and the choice to not actually show it explicitly, and instead just see them both, like, trying to deal with their fate. Wow, that I really, really liked. And because they were no longer acting off of each other and what they were doing was a bit more internal in terms of just processing what just occurred, I actually think the performances were much stronger in those moments. And I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but also just the makeup effects on the infected in that moment, seeing it so close, so vicious. So good. And one more positive, while I had some issues with the chemistry, the tension of knowing they're wandering about this mall after introducing a Chekhov's gun equivalent of an infected who could just appear around any of these corners at any moment. I felt that tension throughout the whole time they were wandering around the mall. I was just like, when's it gonna happen? Now, what's happening in present in this episode and Joel being injured and setting up the big conflict in the next episode. But quickly, I just want to do a reestablishment of ranking of episodes so far because I realize I haven't actually kept up with that. First two together, an 8. Episode 3, 9.5. Just spectacular. Episodes 4 and 5 together, 7.5 to 8 for me. Not as good as 1 and 2, but very solid. Episode 6, I give a 7.5 for just doing what it needed to do extremely well. Episode 7, I'm gonna dip as low as a 6.4. It was above average, it was enjoyable, but it's just not working for me on the sparks level and the chemistry, not there. But then we get to episode 8, and the cult leader cannibals. Holy shit. Once again, a soft-spoken villain who is able to just use their words to get in your ears and mind and gather a flock of followers who are zealots. Petrifying. And the reveal of how they're cannibalizing people I thought was good enough, a bit too blunt, like, do you get it at times? But, you know, I'm the person who always hates that stuff. But there's the tension in the room every time this guy was going off from everyone who was so clearly so accustomed to his abuse was phenomenal. And then them going out for a hunt, running into Ellie, and the confrontation between them and that slow flip of like, you're the one who killed a few of our people, was and then we have the people come to find her and Joel back in the town they've made their little shelter in while Joel's trying to recover from his stab wound, and how he slowly gets up and is more just using his body weight to end up killing a guy. Felt a little convenient because duh, plot needs to happen. But Pedro Pascal's performance totally sold me on it. And Bella Ramsey's like constant fight within the compound where the guy's trying to break her down to make her into a child bride, oh my god, was absolutely in character and knocked out of the park. It was the right call as well to not have Joel save Ellie, and she was able to overcome this, despite how traumatizing it clearly was for her, by just being her best version of Joel, almost. It felt like there were moments where it really felt like, oh, she's utilizing something Joel taught her here. That's great. But there were also some definite Ellie moments where she's like, oh, what are you offering? Break your f***ing finger. And then she just starts slinging insults like only Ellie can in a situation like that. There's also like a subtle implication to me of like, this guy is putting himself out there as like the confident cult leader for these people. And he's effective enough to keep them under his control, but he's not effective enough to to properly feed them or to do anything aside from just giving them this pathetic sense of community that's doing nothing but putting up a false facade of like, oh, you're safe now because you're following me. Whereas like, yeah, if you're caught up in that in a desperate situation where you're looking for any kind of salvation, sure, I could see people buying into that. But from like an outsider's perspective, you're able to look at it and be like, this guy's a failure. And because we had just seen, you know, a successful, thriving communist community compared to this cult leader, I inevitably found myself drawing comparisons to his failures versus their success. So I think that was done deliberately to be like, yeah, he's not going out foraging, trying to find like wider areas, other communities, because he's obsessed with control. He doesn't want to run into another group doing better that, of course, his flock would then just immediately leave him for. So it's all about just containment. And that, I felt that. Like, I felt the containment of his environment as soon as Ellie was thrust into it. It was also so smart to see Ellie be like, I'm infected! Don't eat me! And these people are, of course, paranoid enough about infection to be like, what do you mean? We can check that. Let's check that real quick. And then they see the old scar, and it's like, I don't fully, and then Ellie had bitten him, which I think absolutely was a conscious choice on her part because she knows she can pull off this lie. And that threat, the infected threat, is enough to make one of his followers just go, whoa, which like totally shatters his illusion of control. Very well set up, very well pulled off. They had to make a couple dumb decisions, but you know, they're cult people. I'm very okay with cult people making dumb decisions. And at the very end where Ellie and Joel are reunited, I picked up on Joel's like fatherly instincts being a bit like muted because of everything he's been through. I feel like if this had been Joel we saw in episode 1, he would have been able to handle the trauma or at least assess the trauma that Ellie possibly had been through while obviously caught up in this place a bit better. But in this episode, and then therefore the following episode, he feels a little unsure of how exactly to bridge that gap with her. And I think it's because like that side of him has been totally shut down for all these years. And you watch him consciously, especially in the next episode, try and wake it up. This episode though, solid 9. I thought it was just as good as the Bill and Frank one. It falls almost into that like contained story within a wider narrative setup where we just kind of get the story of this cult and their downfall. Though you could argue it's just a part of Joel and Ellie's narrative as a whole. But unfortunately, this episode being such a high, from here is where I have the biggest issue with the show. It absolutely should have been a 12-episode season. No question in my mind. There was still plenty of room for emotional growth between Joel and Ellie that needed to happen for the final to have the impact it was demanding. And the final episode itself is the shortest episode by a fairly big margin, and it is one of the most important and to the greatest extent felt like just bullet point, just getting through what we know the fans expect to happen here. Done. Now, don't take that as being super negative as we're getting into the last episode. I actually think for what they recreated, they did a good job. Like Joel's shootout in the hospital, fantastically shot. It felt like I was watching a mass shooting happening. It hurt my soul. And that should have been what it was. But simultaneously, I just kept thinking, we're already here? Already? Because we basically just get like 15, it felt like maybe 20 minutes of recovering from the last episode, seeing Ellie's birth, which I don't think we really needed to see. I get they were trying to better set up the connection with the leader of the Fireflies, but I don't emotionally need that. Emotionally, for this narrative, I need as much connection for Joel and Ellie as possible for this ending to land. But instead of giving us those couple more episodes, which the showrunner Craig Mazin, I absolutely believe has the writing in him to create something fantastic for, we just jump, hop, skip to this final stretch, and it wasn't earned. It felt like it was just finally, okay, we're here, let's get through it, done. Previously, when Joel's PTSD has made him commit violent acts, despite it not being my favorite creative choice to show flashes of what happened with his daughter, we're not. And instead, he just kind of, as he's walking down the hall, just goes off and starts just ripping into the people around him. And for me, if you're going to do that, it's not my preferred choice, but be consistent, because on a storytelling level, you're telling me, okay, when that is the motivation for Joel, we're going to show you that's the motivation for Joel. Maybe give a flash of, Sarah and then Ellie or something along those lines. I wouldn't have liked that, but at least it would have been consistent. But instead, he just starts going off and tearing people to pieces. I actually kind of liked seeing Pedro Pascal physically embody, a veteran going up against Fireflies who have no combat training on the level of a former, U.S. military man would have. There was a lot of people he was taking down, but Joel has been so set up as a monster, especially with like the torture scenes and just how efficient he has been just tearing people apart when he needs to, that, yeah, I bought it. I was just like, yeah, these people are running scared. They probably heard of Joel from the leader of the Fireflies, and essentially the boogeyman of this world, as close as you can get without being just infected, is just mowing his way through their ranks. We also, if you catch it, get the setup for Abby here. And then from after the massacre, which it's not a shootout. I phrased it that way on Twitter with also a typo. It's not a shootout. It's a massacre. But from there, I was like, okay, they got that out of the way so they could really have some effective moments in the aftermath of it. But aside from Joel's execution of the leader of the Fireflies, which was well done, him just being like, you'd still come from her. Ah, he's right. He's just convinced of what he's believing is doing is right, and it's selfish, but yeah, he's going to do that. And the way it was shot, the way she's like grunting and bleeding out and just borderline trying to beg for her life, fantastic. Emotionally resonant. Oh my God, Joel is a beast, and I view him that way. Wow. The Last of Us, in my opinion, is building to a point where it is trying to force you as a experiencer of the story to realize that there are extreme circumstances where, unfortunately, the morally right thing to do is, yes, to peacefully and just under anesthetics kill a child to save literally countless of millions of lives. That is the point. And the fact that, and I don't even think it's heavy-handed about it. It's quite heavy-handed to be like, look, like the society will continue to fall apart. All of the terrible shit that's been happening for the last 8 episodes will continue to happen because Joel's trauma overcame his logical brain. But what actually makes that interesting is through the narrative and characters. I think The Last of Us is challenging you to say you would do the same thing, because if you had been through what Joel has been through and you cared about Ellie as much as he does, you would do the same. And that is what makes it fascinating, interesting, morally worth discussing. So when I'm seeing news headlines that are like, did Joel do the right thing? No, he objectively, by loss of life, did not. But you can actually not really judge him. And that's what's beautiful about it. But then we get the wake up in the car with Ellie, and then quickly some hiking, and then they're there. We get one shot of Ellie being like, you promise everything's true. Joel's like, yes, there's doubt, but it felt so just like, okay, we're done. Why? Why not 12 episodes? Was it a budget issue? I'm assuming it's a budget issue. So for the final episode, for what it did well, but it should have had more time, and the last episode was like forced to do so much that even like the giraffe scene just felt like the fans will be mad if it's not there. It's in there. Okay, done. Moving on. I did like the latter joke, though. That was funny. And I'm sure there's going to be people who have the opposite preference, where they like how abrupt it is because it's supposed to feel that way, just like knife to the stomach. Oh my God, this is happening. You don't have time to emotionally recover and process. But for my preference, especially in the wake of something that important, I want some big breaths. Pacing-wise, we need to slow it down, allow both the characters and the audience to fully process and portray what exactly they're going through. And I had consistently been happy with how much the direction for The Last of Us had really let like scenes breathe and moments go by. But in the span of, I want to say just 20 minutes, we went from Joel opening up about Sarah and his suicide attempt to Ellie, them being taken by the Fireflies, the massacre, Joel leaving, and her waking up in the car. That should have been a full episode. Fortunately, though, this was overall a good enough show for me to still be quite happy with its execution. I really enjoy the embodiment of these characters we got this time. I think the bar for a show like this was set way lower before it, and this is, without a doubt, probably the best video game adaptation I've ever seen. No, it's not breaking the curse that was done a long time ago. I would argue with Lara Croft Tomb Raider starring Angelina Jolie. That was king schlock. And I'm gonna say, as a whole, The Last of Us, from me, is going to be getting a very solid 7 to a light 8 out of 10. It's whiffle waffling in there, probably a little closer to an 8 for me. And yes, I'm still really excited for season 2, because if the structure remains the same, we will be able to get actually some breathing room at the start to maybe fully actually enjoy the ramifications of what just happened. But let me know what you think in the comments down below, where you agree and disagree with me, and like and subscribe if you have not already. I got books, I got merch, and later this week, I'm gonna be releasing a video going over the financials of releasing 2 indie books. So if you'd like to see how much money you make putting out a book like that with a platform, go ahead and check that out later this week. Have a good one, y'all. Goodbye!